Hello and welcome to our fourth Startup Global event, Ready, Set, Export, FITT Experts Demystify Trade Planning and Processes. You're all super welcome. I'm Isabel Nolan, the program lead at Startup Canada. So to begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which I am on today is located on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We also acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of all Indigenous peoples. I encourage you to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territories you're residing on today. Today's session is being recorded and live streamed onto Facebook, and we'll also share the recording afterwards on our YouTube channel as well. And we invite all of our attendees to introduce themselves and connect with each other in the chat. Feel free to share your name, your organization, where you're joining in from. If you have any questions throughout today's event, you can add them to the Q&A box at the bottom bar, and our moderator will ask on your behalf to the speakers. So a little bit about Startup Canada. Startup Canada is a national non-for-profit that is the gateway to Canada's entrepreneurial ecosystem. We're here to connect entrepreneurs with the support, community, and tools that they need to build a successful business in Canada. Since launching in 2012, Startup Canada has grown to support more than 122,000 entrepreneurs annually and an ever-growing grassroots community network from coast to coast to coast. Startup Global is one of Startup Canada's flagship programs that connects a pan-Canadian cohort of entrepreneurs wanting to build a global business with a network of partners dedicated to their success through workshops like this one today, boot camps, pitch building, advisory support, digital resources, and more, all housed in an accessible and easy-to-use online portal. This free program recognizes the importance of exporting to the Canadian economy, celebrates those making waves in the global marketplace, and empowering early stage founders to take their ventures to the international stage. I'd like to take a moment to thank our co-presenting partners, Export Development Canada, or EDC, Trade Commissioner Service, or TCS, and UPS, and our national and community partners, Forum for International Trade Training, or otherwise known as FITT, MasterCard, Scotiabank, eBay, and Google. Today's workshop will give you everything you need to start successfully planning and implementing your going global strategies, from sourcing to marketing to building your team. This session will be led by FITTskills instructor and CITP, Laura Riguto, in conversation with two guests, including Daniel Lewis, also a CITP, founder of Daniel's Chai Bar, an entrepreneur who has built a business from the ground up and taken it international, and Marvin Hoff, CITP and president of Mira, an advisor with 30+ years experience helping businesses of all sizes enter global markets successfully. Together, they will provide multiple points of views and experiences on putting international strategies into practice for small businesses. Without further ado, I will pass it over to Laura.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Isabel, and thank you, Startup Canada, for the invitation to put this amazing panel together as part of your Startup Global program. FITT is thrilled to have 3 certified international trade professionals, or CITPs for short, for the next 90 minutes to help you take some of the mystery out of exporting, storytell with the good, bad, the ugly lessons learned, teach you the importance of planning, and provide a glimpse into what you need to know to get started. Whether you sell goods or services or both, there may be tremendous opportunities for you to grow your business outside of the domestic border. In fact, going global can make you more efficient, make you more competitive, and make you stronger. However, if exporting were easy, every company would do it. So today's scope is to help you understand what's involved and outline some of the risks of going and growing global. We'll provide a very high level A to Z of exporting, everything from feasibility of international trade to market entry strategies to international sales and marketing and finance. So, tall order. So let's get started. So when we talk about feasibility of international trade, we're principally referring to 3 broad components. So we're talking about export readiness. Is your venture really ready to start exporting? You have the resources required to venture into foreign markets. We also talk about choosing your target market. Where should you start? And third thing we talk about when we refer to feasibility is the suitability of your products and services. Is your product or service suitable for your target market, or do you need to modify it in some way? Or rather, often the question is not if you should localize your product, but rather how much should be modified, and the importance of weighing the cost benefit of doing so. So if we go back and we look at that first step under export readiness, or if we look at export readiness, that first step in assessing your export readiness is to do a SWOT analysis. You must assess your strengths and weaknesses and figure out your gaps. The second step is why, asking yourself those tough questions. Why are you exporting? Who is going to get the work done? And are you really ready? So on that note, Daniel, I'm going to start with you. Can you tell us a little bit about your company's journey to importing and exporting to international trade? And when you determined, when you were ready to go global?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Laura. And hello to everybody out there. First off, I feel like I can't start without acknowledging that amazing music in the beginning. That's really, really kicked things off well. So thank you for that. So Daniel's Chai Bar, the thing I like to say is that we started importing, exporting accidentally, and then we learned how to do it the right way. So a lot of what I learned was by mistake. I found myself exporting. We started our company thinking, let's just impact the community that we're in, which was working. But then it got to a point where the people that we were impacting in our local market, well, they have family that visits. They have people coming in, and when they would experience our brand and our products, we started to hear the questions like, do you ship to the US? Do you ship to Australia, Japan, and things like that? And at first, it's easy to kind of brush it off because you're just not there, you just started. But when it keeps happening and happening, then you're like, wait a minute, is there business or potential business elsewhere that I'm just not really, locking in on? That's what started to happen for us. We started to sense a demand, especially from the US, for our teas in this case. And we had to start thinking how to get it there. And this kind of got us on a journey of what I say in the beginning. It was just a whole bunch of, what do we package in? How do we ship it? Are there any documents that we need to ship it? And we made a lot of mistakes in those early stages until we started to learn from those experiences and get on our feet in solid footing. And another thing that happened was we started to learn that in the US, let's say, which was one of our big exporting places, it's very different than Canada. The people are different. The buying decisions are different. The buying motivators are different. So all of that just kind of piled in all at once. And then eventually we learned, we tapped into resources like FITT to kind of refine that process.
So that's so interesting. So can I just ask you, what were some of those gaps that you had to address first when you were, before you could make that leap? What were some of, top 3 or whatever, the major gaps?
Yeah, one of the biggest gaps for us is we've always, from the inception, we've branded ourselves as a company who uses tea as a tool to impact people's lives in a positive way. So it's story, why, and mission before product. And though that resonated very well here in Canada with people who know us and know our story, and it's easy to share, well, when you go to an international market like the US, they don't really know you, and that connection was not the same. So we literally had to find a strategic way of turning that around and making there be a product focus with a good underlining story, which was for us the complete opposite of how we were branding and marketing ourselves. So in the US market and UK, it was product first, underlining story behind it. In Canada, it was story first, mission first, and we sell tea. So we literally had to refine and change our messaging, and it was big for us, really, really big for us. That was one of the biggest issues for us.
How interesting. That's great. Thanks, Daniel. And Marvin, I know that you've had many clients over the years, and you continue to have a portfolio of clients. How do you assess or help your clients evaluate their own export readiness?
Yes, I mean, it is a huge issue, Laura. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and great to see Startup Canada and FITT working on this. In Canada, we have about 1 million SMEs, and only about 4% are actually exporting. And out of those, as you probably would imagine, about 3/4 sell into the United States. So going global for a entrepreneur, a startup, a SME is a really, challenging mode, but it's exciting for companies. And I would say there's 3 good news points about it. And I'll go into some of the readiness factors, but the 3 good news points, there are more groups available now to help entrepreneurs than ever before. And FITT is one of those groups, and Startup Canada is one of those groups, and EDC, and I'll go through them. So that's good news. The second is that, and Daniel will probably talk a bit about this, that, as we go to a digital revolution, that makes a big difference, and it can mean that SMEs find easier path into markets. That's not to say that it's going to be all easy and no regulation. The third point is that SMEs and startups can be very flexible, can be agile, and that's a huge factor, as Daniel has already sort of intimated, to be able to pivot and change the way they're operating. That is really, really important. So when I talk to companies, I put them through a readiness checklist, and that checklist can be quite extensive, but I'll just mention some of the points that I think are really important that companies look at. And number 1 is management commitment to the export field, whether that be to the US or further. It's really important, and probably, Laura, that's the one that I've seen companies say they're ready and they want to go at it, but 2 months later they come back and they've got another priority, and that priority outweighs the export. So, companies have to be right at the top, really sure they're ready, and ideally have some experience in exporting, but if they don't, they can learn quickly. The second part is about foreign market research, and the good news there is, you get many more sources these days online, which is really good. I think thirdly, I would say having the financing set up and support, and that is important, whether you have to adapt your product or just survive in completing an order and having working capital. So many companies I've seen, they're stretched and they've got an export order, but they lack that risk management side, and they're not going to be able to complete it. So that one is really important, and I'll tell you a bit more about that as we go along. The other point that I would say is so important is as you enter a market, it's often the case, in most cases, you'll be relying on an agent, a partner, a distributor. And what I've seen is so often smaller companies get excited about the market, and they all of a sudden have an agent, and they think they've got to step 1 and they're going to progress, whereas they haven't done the full analysis, and that's a recipe for spinning of wheels and sometimes disaster if your company agent is not fully up to speed on technical, on financial capability, on understanding your product, and having the right connections. So those are really important. As Daniel mentioned, there's many others. as you get into it, from getting the right freight forwarder to understanding, the promotional material requirements in the country, all of those things are on a list. And I guess you were going to ask about the tools. One of the really good tools is at the Trade Commissioner website, tradecommissioner.gc.ca, under the Get Help for Exporting tab. And individual companies can actually go through that and complete the quiz, answering all of these specific readiness factors. And I would really recommend any companies contemplating that, start there. And if you don't have an answer, or the answer is no to some of those questions, then consult with individuals like us, but many others who I can recommend. So FITT does a course as well. Maybe you'll talk about, Laura, of situational analysis course and others that can help on the preparedness side. EDC is also a good source. They're ready to export. And when I was at EDC, which is now 10 years ago, that was a big factor in, assessing companies, because EDC is, going to mobilize to support you, but if you're not ready for exporting, it can be a spinning of wheels. So all of these organizations are really great for companies starting out. And to me, it's like I said, the stats show that we've got so much more we can do with smaller companies, and startups are part of that process, that I think we're going to see more events like this, and more attention on the startup segment, because they can grow quickly, and you never know. There's always surprises in exporting, and sometimes companies, and Daniel, maybe you can talk to this too, but you can have a preparedness checklist, but all of a sudden you've got an export order that comes out of the blue. Maybe your cousin went to Mexico and mentioned your product, and all of a sudden here's the order. Well, that can be a exciting, challenging, overwhelming situation, but it's also a great learning, because again, what I said earlier, SMEs and startups learn quickly, and Daniel is a good example of that, I think. So that would be my suggestion, is how to get ready. Really draw on as many of the players, government players. There's federal government players like the Trade Commissioner Service and Global Affairs, EDC, CCC. There's provincial government support groups. There's municipal government support for exporting, and then consultants. There's banks. Banks are much more involved in supporting together with EDC. So as you think about this, one of the things is to make sure you have contacts and have resources to contact these different groups, because they're essential for a SME to really, grow into the exports.
I love that. That's fantastic. And I'm constantly telling, whether it's students or other businesses, like, tap into this amazing network that's available to you. And a lot of the resources that you mentioned, Marvin, that export readiness, that quiz that TCS has, I can't tell you how many people I've referred to that and said, pay attention, like, those questions, give it some serious thought, because there's a lot there to unpack. So, but as you mentioned, small, medium-sized enterprises, startups, they're often very nimble, and knowing where to go and maybe which level of government to tap into, or all of the multiple levels of government and industry associations and organizations that support trade. And you mentioned you mentioned EDC, and so there's so much There's so many tools out there. There's so many resources that, sometimes, and one thing, I wanted to mention, and just jumping onto what you said, you're never too small to start exporting, right? Sometimes, small company startups think they're just too small. They're just too small, but you're never too small to exporting. You just have to understand, where your gaps are, tap into the right resources that can help you. So yeah, very, very good. Thank you, Marvin and Daniel. So if we move along and we've determined that, in fact, you're ready to export, next is that looming question: how do you determine which markets to start exporting to? Which markets or to start exporting to? Because I always have a cautionary tale of saying, okay, we're going to start exporting and we're going to go to, we're going to do Europe and we're going to go to Asia and we're going to go to South America. So, I caution companies to really get focused on their target market and don't take on too many markets at the same time. That's often a recipe for disaster. So, and as you mentioned, like many companies start exporting because fulfilling orders that have come to them, like either through e-commerce or a random request in their inbox. I mean, it sounds great, doesn't it? But I've also heard from companies, and I have experience working with, manufacturers where they get an international order, and there's a tremendously steep learning curve. The vendor may not be set up to ship internationally, may not understand things like customs procedures in those markets where the orders have come from, understand all the risks, understand, requirements like labeling and packaging. So if we take that strategic approach to market expansion instead of just kind of happenstance, right? Marvin, how would you suggest these startups approach market expansion? Like, are there certain types of markets that are good, like testing ground for first-time exporters?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, as I suggested, for a lot of the SMEs, the United States market, where there's, cultural affinity, we're very similar in many ways and conduct business in similar ways, is very logical. And, there are programs. One that comes to mind is called the NEBS program, run by Ontario government, where it's really new exporters to border states, where an individual company is going through the readiness stage, but they can go into the US basically for a 2-day program and get all of the sort of details about the crossing the border and all of the business factors from a currency exchange to tax and legal issues, and gain that knowledge firsthand, which is always great. In doing research, you've got primary and secondary, but what better way to go into Buffalo for 2 days and meet with all of the officials who can facilitate for you. So that's on a logical plan basis, Laura, but there's always, as we said, orders that come, and companies have to evaluate them. And, I think that for a SME, having somebody really on the top of the research is very important. Whether it's an employee or actually engaging a consultant to do that. There's just a plethora of information online through government websites here in Canada, but the foreign country government websites. I find industry associations have really good information as a company looks at getting into a sector. There's, trade associations that can be helpful, the FITT courses. All of these things come into play, And I think that smaller companies, as you suggested, should really, when they have opportunities, think, what is the most logical one that I can start with, and take a stepping stone approach, because spreading themselves too thin and not having the capacity, which is another factor in my readiness list, is double damaging. It can damage your reputation, and it can mean that you can't fill that order, and financially that could be very impactful. So sometimes it's hard to stop the enthusiasm. And, you want to see a company get into it, and when orders come, that is something that is really a tangible side that you have to evaluate whether you're able to do that. So having a research consultant alongside can be extremely important in my experience for a smaller company. And the management, I hope, would recognize that could be the way for sustainable exporting. Otherwise, you're really sort of flying by, without a plan, kind of thing.
Right. Can I just ask Daniel, because you also mentioned you started, I guess your target market was the United States, and it just happened that way because of family, family members crossing the border and demanding it. So would you say you were more strategic in your choice of the United States, or it was because those, the people were asking you? And if you were to do it again, would you be more strategic about choosing your target markets? I don't know. I might be putting you on the spot here.
No, that's great. And absolutely. I was not strategic. I was reacting. And it's a place you don't want to find yourself in when it comes to exporting. And to backtrack and kind of touch on this as well, Marvin touched on a great point about you could have this checklist and this plan, and then boom, something else just sidetracks it. Well, that happened to me in many cases, and I was not ready necessarily. With my books, so I'm also an author, and I said I'm open to the world. Be careful of just saying that vaguely, that you're open internationally, selling internationally, because I was selling my book for $9, and I got an order from Vienna. And long story short, by the time I shipped that and got it to the customer, it cost me $85. It was either that or they had to wait like 5 months to get this book. And so it traces back to that strategic approach. When you're doing research, the US is close, yes, right? But is that going to be the best market logistically for you? Is it going to be the best market from a sales and marketing standpoint? Are there trade agreements between Canada, where you live, and that market or that country that you're trading into? You want to know those things, because all of those things are going to have implications. When we started to facilitate orders in the US, and we didn't know about the HS codes that we needed to declare and put on our packaging, and we just got hit so hard with just this influx of information that we weren't prepared for. If I was to do it again, I would have brought all my thoughts into one place, find people who have experience or courses, FITT, TAP, these kind of resources that I can come on calls like this, and they could just make me aware to the things that I don't know about exporting and importing. And that's what I didn't do before. So, if I was to do it over again, definitely. And Marvin also talked about, making that commitment from a management standpoint to whether it's finding out the research that's required, what are the sizes of your, in my case, the product that you are shipping? Is that going to have a dramatic implication from a weight standpoint and how much it's going to cost you to ship? All of those things are things that are very important, and you want to make sure you've at least thoroughly looked into them. So absolutely would do it differently, and did. Eventually I corrected those mistakes and found the right way, getting training, attending workshops virtually, online research, reading books. and then just felt so much more ready. And it also gives you a psychological confidence to start exporting. Because before I was getting to a place where I didn't want orders to come in anymore because I'm just going to mess it up, right? But once you feel ready, you get more aggressive in doing business and getting sales and facilitating those orders. Then your customer service kicks in, and that's when business starts to thrive.
Wow.
Just
That's
a couple
great.
of points to add, Laura, and sometimes this really comes up in big markets, is that the idea that you're going to be selling into the US or selling into Mexico is a fallacy in the sense of the entire market. So
Yes.
I've seen so many companies think that they're into the market, and really they've only got a little bit of a foothold in a particular city. And we have to realize that there are differences in these big markets, in regions, in cities, and that is part of your analysis. And the other point is, I've been teaching here at the Telfer School of Management, and in the MBA and EMBA programs in many universities, there are programs in the international business side where international research projects are undertaken for companies, and that can be a sort of a free service. So I would highly recommend as companies look at these things, that they consider engaging some of these EMBA and MBA students who are studying and preparing the exact thing that companies need to do, is a full analysis on markets and maybe comparative markets. FITT even has a template that goes through a list of about 100 different factors that you would look at in different markets. And that can be a tremendous asset for a company to engage a group like that who work for a few months on it and draw on their analysis. So that's just a
Fantastic
suggestion.
Yeah, great tips, Marvin. Thank you for that. And thanks, Daniel. So moving along, so when we're talking about, if we're looking at the suitability of our products and services for the target market, let's say we determined, this is our target market. Often the next question is, well, do we need to localize our product? And in some cases, I know it might be hard to hear, but sometimes we need to make that product less Canadian or less national, right? But at the same time, knowing that there is a trade-off between standardization and localization, and you have to assess, what's nice to have versus need to have. And one of those needs, of course, is like health and safety standards, or certain, complying with regulatory requirements in the target market in order to be able to sell your product or offer your service in the market. So the importance of doing that cost benefit analysis and understanding that each iteration costs money. And lots of money. In my experience working for a manufacturer, every time we got, a product UL approved, it was thousands of dollars, right? Every modification on our product costs thousands of dollars, getting it through approvals and time. So, Daniel, if I can just ask you, so how did you adapt did you adapt your product or service for your new export markets? And what if you did, what was it that you adapted?
Great question, Laura. So first, yes, the answer was yes. Not only did we adapt, we had to adapt. When you're going into a new market, your product is going to be perceived very differently than the local market that you're currently selling in. One of the ways that I remember we definitely had to make some alterations was in the quantity or the size of the packages of tea we were selling. It's very different when you're here in Brampton or Toronto selling $5 pouches of tea, that quantity. When somebody places an order in the US or in the UK, well, they're going to be waiting for this product to come. They're probably going to want more substantial quantity of that product if they're going to pay shipping, if they're going to wait you know, 2, 3, 5, sometimes a week for that product to come, just getting a small amount is probably not going to be enough. So we had to come out with different SKUs, different amounts, so that, you know, a person might spend $25 and get a good substantial amount of the product. That was one way. The labeling, right? The labeling and the messaging. As you alluded to, and especially I know a lot of people use the US as their market that they want to get into just because of ease. But the US, as Marvin alluded to, I mean, it can almost be every state is a country, right? In and of itself. Well, tea, in my case, in the South is very different than tea on the East Coast, in the West, in the South, in the North. It's very, very different. What they understand to be sweet tea or iced tea in the South is very different. So how do we market that? We can't say the same things. We have to find a way to say it strategically to our target market. And that's why I always say, this is more on a sales marketing tip, but when you're going into a market and you say, this is your target, stay away from words like all, everyone who, or anyone who. That is too vast of a target market. And you're going to have difficulties in many cases effectively advertising if you're saying my product is for anyone who or everyone who. It's not niche enough. So we had to find ways to speak to our audience. Another thing was the flavors and the types of tea that we carry. We thought, you know, tea, it has this, you know, nice English heritage, the type of teas we were carrying. So this is going to be perfect. You know, you have your cream of Earl Greys and all that English breakfast. Well, that's not necessarily what they like in the US, right? They were more into the specialty teas that have raspberry and lime and lemon. Very different than what we were thinking. So while we're trying to be pure tea enthusiasts, the US is like, give me the sweet, yummy flavors that remind me of things that I like to enjoy every day. Well, we have to source new products, right? But when we started selling to the UK, well, this is where we need to play up on the Earl Greys and the things like that. So you really, really need to know how you are, if it's the type of product that's solving, you know, a pain point for a customer, what's the pain point here as opposed to here? If it's a flavor variation, what's the palette here as opposed to here? You have to be able to answer all those questions, and it even comes down to the language. How do you talk to that customer in that target market? You know, we were very fun with our labeling. Like we have a tea called Rated R for raspberry, right? And, you know, this exotic flavor of raspberry, and that's really cool. The English, you know, in Britain and in London, it didn't resonate the same way. Let's just say that way. We had to be a little bit more acknowledging the heritage of tea, a little bit more, but you also don't want to lose your brand in the process. Mm-hmm. So it's really a strategic way of bringing your brand together, staying and holding, you know, holding down your brand image identity, but talking to different markets. It's definitely a skill.
That's amazing. That's really interesting. And you also mentioned earlier how here in Canada, because there was an awareness of your brand, you were marketing yourselves. Right. And then, you know, in the US, because there was zero brand awareness, so then you were marketing the teas, and, you know, the story came secondary. So it's, you know, adapting your messaging, right? Absolutely. Is part of product adaptation. It's all part of it.
Absolutely. You got it.
Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. And what about Marvin? I was just wondering, what kind of, like, how do you research what goes into product development and adaptation? Like, do you have, you know, do you have any advice for companies? Because it's can be overwhelming to you know, find all the relevant regulations and legal requirements. Do you have any advice?
Well, sure. I mean, in my experience, the sort of product adaptation spectrum goes from no adaptation right on through to you might have to have 50% local content in your product. I spent a few years down in Mexico where trying to help some Canadian companies get into the Pemex, the national oil company, and you had to have local content on all of the orders, all of the bids, 20% in some cases, 30% in other cases. So, I mean, the research has to be both, I think, secondary and primary. the reference point of the Canadian Embassy or Canadian Consulate is very important, because they can point out, product specifications in some cases for individual orders, but also in most of the countries, and in fact, generally across the board, there are industry associations that can be tapped to find out if your product qualifies. In markets, of course, there's always non-tariff barriers that are there, designed to protect local industry and keep people safe and protect the environment. Some of those reasons are there as well, but those factors can mean that you have to change your packaging. I think, as Daniel was mentioning, the size, the aesthetics, the design, all of those issues are really important, Laura, and you're right to equate it with the cost, because if you're just getting going and you find out your product adaptation costs are going to be through the roof, this may mean that it's just a non-viable scenario. So I recommend drawing on the trade commissioners, drawing on the industry associations. Other Canadian companies in the market can also be very helpful. And if you have an agent who's able to support you with a pilot testing, is very important in some industries. And we've seen that in markets like Mexico, where, by the way, you think Mexico is part of the NAFTA, the new NAFTA. There's a lot of trade barriers right across that border. And one shouldn't assume that a free trade agreement means that, things will just flow smoothly, because a lot of these non-tariff barriers are there impacting products. And in some cases, you have to investigate on the ground. So coming back to my earlier point about selecting the right partner or agent, if you have a high caliber partner, they can help tremendously with finding out what adaptation, if any, is needed, what servicing is needed in the market as well. So big issue for companies. And as I said, I've seen companies go on the full spectrum from not having to adapt much at all to really having to change their whole product and or service and meet the local requirements.
Yeah, fantastic. And I totally agree with what you said about, finding the right agent in the market. We had an experience as well with getting our product tested, and it wasn't until we appointed an agent in the market, and this was Mexico as well, that we found out that there was a laboratory, and if you wanted to sell your product in the market, it had to be tested, by that laboratory. And
right.
we had spent months. We never came across that. So, and that was because of the agent. So that actually brings me, so we're going to take a little bit of a break here, and we have a question, and this is a topic that we're going to get to in the second half of today, but we have Joseph that's asking, Joseph San Luis is asking, how do I calculate my risk management before I enter a new market? And should I use an agent or set up my own distribution? So Daniel, Marvin, who would like to answer that?
Marvin, you want to take a shot at it first?
Just repeat it, Laura, so I get the full flavor of it.
Yeah, so there's really two questions. Maybe we'll start with the second part. Entering in a new market, because we've just had a discussion about agents. So it says, should I use an agent or set up my own distribution? So how about we start with the second part of Joseph's question first?
Sure. Well, I think, you know, it depends largely on your expertise in the market. If it's the US market next door and you've been through some of the preparation and training and feel comfortable that you've got your staff, you know, familiar, you may not need that agent. But in many cases, you know, the big factor is the agent's local knowledge, local connections, and the, as you intimated, sort of the capacity to troubleshoot for you in the market. And I think that is a big part of risk management. So looking at, you know, your full, all the functions you need to carry out for that exporting. You may have a good freight forwarder who's really giving you good advice. You may have a consultant who's already helped you with the pricing and the logistics are working well. You've got some staff who are, you know, very much familiar with the market. You need to do that kind of analysis. If you don't have those players, you're likely you need that agent and you know, by all means, spend time on qualifying that agent or partner, go down, look at their facilities, you know, understand their capacity for technical support, for technical knowledge. Like there's a lot of agents who are really good on the connection side, but they don't understand your product. So that's going to fall flat for you. It doesn't take very long. If an agent's out there and he's representing your product, will do something that it won't. So those are the kinds of analyses that you have to do. And you know, there's not one answer to that. It's evaluating your own capacity. But I really, the strongest point that I would say is the importance of building that agent or rep into a really fully competent you know, individual, understands your product, and then capitalize on all of the things he or she can bring to the business for you.
Absolutely, absolutely, great. And Daniel, if you can take a stab at this too.
So these are the areas, to your question, that I think your export plan can really help clear up for you, because this is the time to think about it, because it starts with what is your market entry strategy, right? There's typically around 4 ways you can enter the market. I might be missing another one, but there's typically 4. So are you going to be indirectly exporting? Are you going to be directly exporting to your consumer? So you're sending your products directly to the end user. Are you trying to establish a partnership? Whereas maybe that partner is on boots on the ground for you in that market. Or are you looking for like a foreign direct investment? How are you planning to go into that market? When you research this and go through this thoroughly in your export plan, then it starts to present options to you. There are third parties who can act as boots on the ground for you in that market, like agencies. That's what they do. That could be a good way, but they have several clients, right? So what's their motivator? How are they going to prioritize you and your products in that market? So that may be a good thing for you. It may be a detractor for you. If you're doing a partnership, what skills does that partner who's boots on the ground for you have there? Does it work to your benefit? Are you going to have to be basically micromanaging that partner on the ground, traveling a lot? You know, those are things that you got to really think about. Or do you just want to take it on by yourself and think, you know, maybe you can get those channels, the supply chain, the forwarding. I remember when I started, I was using an agent for importing and exporting because there was all these terminologies I didn't know, like manifest documents and, you know, all these different terms. I'm like, okay, what's a manifest? They're like, do you have the bill of lading? I'm like, is it lading or lading? I have no idea. But I took the time to learn what it was. And what I was able to find out was that it's not that confusing if you just take some time to learn it. I eventually wiped out the middle forwarder and I started clearing products and bringing them. This is on an import side, but I started importing products from suppliers from China, South Africa myself. And I can tell you this, when I went to customs, I saw people in tears at the border trying to clear their products and goods for their business, right? Just because they didn't know the right codes, they didn't have the bill of lading. I still don't know what it is, the manifest documents. But then I got to a place where I was confident. I knew the right codes. I knew the right questions. I knew everything I needed to do to clear products and come through. So I took that journey on myself. And I took a lot of the importing and exporting on myself. And so I will always point you back to your research and to your export document that should answer those questions for you, because there's pros and cons to every single option. But I'm a huge fan as a business owner of learning it for myself. It will help me even vet future partners to know I'm not getting the best deal. You're not the most strategic partner, because I understand it myself.
Right. Great advice. And also, yeah, it's about either, upskilling yourself, into some of these areas. And I know that actually Pam from FITT has been dropping some great checklists and some great information. The FITTskills training is invaluable to basically take you through that export journey. So if you're busy with your, producing product or developing your software, whatever that might be, and you don't have time, at least, hire or get your employees upskilled so that maybe there's somebody that does like an international trade finance course and another person that does the international sales and marketing, or, you don't have to do it all, because, it might be a bigger commitment than you're willing to do, but the importance of understanding what you don't know that you need to know. Like, a lot of times you just don't know. You mentioned the manifest, or if I drop Incoterms, I'm sure a lot of people are like, Inco what? So understanding, what are Incoterms, and the importance of using Incoterms in your contract for sale of goods, and all these things that you may not even, you've never even heard the terminology before, but make sure somebody within your company, your small business, make sure somebody understands, or maybe understands enough so that they'll take a course, understands enough so that they'll say, you know what, we need a partner, we need to contract a logistics person, like an external logistics company, or knowing that you need help is part of the solution, right? So, and I love your idea of preparing an export plan. And I think, Joseph, to answer your question, how do you calculate your risk management? You do an export plan, and then that, but in doing that process of preparing to export will reveal, your risk management gaps, and hopefully you'll come up with solutions to address that. But Esmeralda had a good question. We at the World Trade Center Winnipeg offer Trade Accelerator program for Manitoba companies. What would you advise for companies that feel too small to start exporting outside of Canada? So we kind of mentioned at the get-go that you're not necessarily too small to start exporting, you just need to plan. So Marvin, Daniel, if we had to answer this question, I would say my answer just is like, jumping on the whole planning. Like if you fail to plan, essentially, it doesn't matter if you're a small company, a large company, if you fail to plan, you're essentially planning to fail in your export journey. So that would be my advice to companies, to plan. How about you, Marvin or Daniel?
Well, yes, definitely. And I've seen some very small companies, but they've taken, a very incremental approach into, say, the US market, and it's really worked out for them. But, not biting off more than they can chew, in the sense of representing what their capacity is really important. So if the motivation is there, if the commitment is there, it's not all about size. It really is about preparedness. And as I said, with digital applications, platforms, this gives even more opportunity for the small company. And some, you know, there's so many young people these days that are so good on the digital platforms that all of a sudden they're exporting. And that's good news.
If I could add to that, I'd like to kind of answer that question in two parts. We're talking about, you know, you feel too small to start exporting or selling your products globally, internationally. The first part that I would take that on is its perspective. You're not too small, especially in this day and age, in this economy where companies like Etsy exist, right? And Etsy, if you don't know, are these, you know, cool handmade products, just cool niche things. Sometimes they're very DIY, they're very craft looking, just pulling on something. It could be a little succulent plant that you make, right? And you think, oh no, this is not big business, but somebody wants it somewhere. And it's never too small to answer or solve that problem. And that's why I always like to position my company or companies or products based on a mission, not just a product, not just a service. Because when you're mission oriented, it lets you see the value beyond just what you might even think of it yourself, right? Tea, can it go everywhere? That's a product. But because I want to impact people's lives in a positive way, and that's the mission I've taken on for my brand, I have to ask myself as a business owner, are there people in Mexico who can be impacted in a positive way? Are there people in the UK? It just becomes much more bigger. So it changes my perspective of just thinking my product could only serve the immediate need around me, you know, because the mission of the company is much bigger. And every big business started from some small idea. So I would change the perspective that you're too small first. Second, really complements Marvin's point in terms of there are so many resources, so many platforms. Like I also work at Shopify as a content creator. Now on the Shopify, which I use that to power my e-commerce site, literally clicks of the button can set you up to sell globally, whether it's currency, so that you know, somebody shopping in Australia, you know, they can see what the currency of your product will be like in their dollar, or in China or somewhere else. Click of a button. You could set up shipping zones. And so it automates my shipping processing in terms of the label that comes from UPS or Canada Post. Click of a button, right? It even gives me market insights. There's so many things. You know, an order came in the other day from Korea, first order ever from South Korea. Never received an order from there. And it warned me on Shopify that there's a different kind of coding that must be on 2 places on my package, or else the package will come back. I would have never known that, right? And so don't be afraid, because you have the Trade Commissioner, you have EDC, you have BDC, you have TAP, you have FITT. Everybody's here to kind of usher you into that international market. You just got to put in the time and strengthen your networks. You're never too small.
Great answer. Great answer. Fantastic. Well, I'm looking at the time. It's 1 o'clock, so we're an hour in. Time just flies when you're having fun, and we've touched on so many points. So if we continue along this export journey, because I want to make sure that we have enough time to cover the broad areas that, you know, companies need to be aware of if they're looking to start exporting. But if we cover these broad areas, and don't worry, we will answer any remaining questions at the end of this next session. But I just want to make sure that we touch on a couple of more broad areas that you need to know, right? If we continue along with this theme of, you know, you don't know what you don't know. So we'll look. So if we you know, we've learned that we're really ready to export. We're not too small to start exporting. We've determined our target market and understand, you know, the markets within markets that are really our target markets. Assess the suitability of our products or service. for that market, identified whatever, the required product modifications. So now what? So in the next little while, we're going to explore some important factors to consider when you're planning. So when you're doing your export plan, like international market entry. So we did touch on that. There was a great question about using agents or distributors. International sales and marketing. I know we keep touching on international sales and marketing. We have over the first hour. We're going to dive a little bit deeper about into that. Supply chain and logistics, which I don't know if we're going to be able to cover, do it justice in the time remaining, as well as international trade finance. So if we look at market entry strategies, there are many options for you. And I think Marvin and Daniel talked about it. Everything from your low risk category where you can license your product to someone else or sell to a local trading company. I think you touched on this, Daniel, all the way to the other end of the spectrum where we are looking at FDI, like foreign direct investment, maybe you build a factory in a target market. So you've got low risk, maybe low reward, because generally the margins are really small. And then the other end of the spectrum, high risk, but the ROI can be quite good in the long run. So many options available between those two extremes. Including, direct exporting through a distributor, wholesaler, partnering with a VAR, so many options. And what's important here is that you need to understand the various options available to you and the cost benefit of each option. But you need to look at the barriers to entry for your target market in particular, and the risk and your own risk profile in order to determine the appropriate strategy. So we did have a question about risk management earlier that we answered, but when we're looking at, Daniel, I'm just going to ask you, when we looked at market entry, what factored into your company's market entry approach?
Absolutely. Great question. Two parts. So for the tea company, when it came to us exporting teas, the times, I'm tapping into the times of digital marketing, social media influence, that these are strategies and methods. Customers, it's not abnormal for your customer to be on social media anymore in any industry. You could be selling wood and logs somewhere. Those customers are on social media. You got to find out which social media platform they're on. In our case, for tea, these tea lovers, tea enthusiasts, and people who would, we felt during our research would adapt to our product, they're on Instagram. And so the approach we took in establishing customers in that market was influencer marketing and nano influencers. And I'll explain really quickly what that is. It's basically people who have, well, for influencers, they pretty much have 1,000 followers and up, and they are known to be or trusted on a certain topic. To give reviews, to talk about products they like, unbiased, so they can literally try one of our teas and be like, didn't really like it, don't see what the hype is about, and we like that. But what they were doing was spreading awareness in a demographic, in a market. We would partner up with them, send them products, and we were getting those reviews. They would do a review, orders would come in. As orders would come in, it would spread, and it literally was a grassroots approach, but it really happened quickly. Get the right influencer, which we found one in Chicago when we were getting into the US, and things just expanded quickly. We gave her a coupon code so she can get some kickback from it, and literally we had tons of orders. This one person brought in so much business for us, just like that, influencer marketing. Nano influencer is literally just a smaller type of influencer. They maybe only have 200 followers, but they're real, they're trusted in their family, in their community, in their neighborhood. And that's another, organic way to build a market entry. That's what we did. Another, on the speaking, as a speaker and an author, be an expert in your field. Go and speak at a trade show. That was how I started to carve out business internationally. I went to the industry. There's literally an industry trade show for anything you sell. usually in Vegas, so double whammy. And if you speak there or do a session topic or a workshop or anything like that, all of a sudden eyes start to turn on you and people start to research you. And that's what started to, I started to get bookings in the States and in different areas there. So be an expert in your field, write blogs. You don't even have to go there. Write blogs and articles on the topic or the product you sell. These are ways of entering a market subliminally or through the side door, and then starting to build outwardly. And that's what we use. There's many methods, but that's one of the ways we got in.
Laura, I'm just going to add a point, if I may.
Yep.
One of the very important factors on market entry is a really solid competitive analysis of what your competitors are doing. And, this is extremely important in markets. Give you an example. When I was in Mexico, working with a Canadian company that builds machines to produce the plastic bottles for Coca-Cola and other soft drinks. And they were in a very competitive situation. And their competitor from Italy had a servicing center right in Mexico City. The Canadian company said, if there's any problem, we'll fly down. It's only 6 hours, right? You can understand that the Mexican buyers wanted local service and local training. So, to do that analysis, you can look at the costs of getting your product in. You can look at, potentially setting up a plant down there or doing a joint venture. But many cases, the competitive analysis is really a critical factor. There could be local competitors who have distinct advantages in bidding processes, as I mentioned before. And I think in international business these days, the idea of selling a product without the servicing behind it or spare parts, depending on what kind of an industry you're in, this is a very critical factor. And sometimes it's, Canadian companies are slow to realize that.
Yeah, that is an excellent point. That is an excellent point. And a huge factor. It's also, there's no easy answer, right? It all depends on, your industry profile and the product or service you sell, and finding that right partner, finding that right approach to market entry. It's just so individual, right? And I've experienced in the same industry amongst competitors, we all had different approaches to market entry. Like company I was with through a value-added reseller, other companies were through distributors, other companies, they went direct. And it's very interesting within the same industry, same size of company, but differently structured, obviously, the different strategies that companies employed. So, the importance of evaluation, right? As you mentioned, and you're doing that competitive analysis too. And okay, so if we continue on, this is a journey, isn't it? So my favorite topic is international sales and marketing. And I know that we've touched on various aspects of international sales and marketing throughout today so far. It's often, I find it's often like the requirements are often oversimplified just because of a lack of understanding of the target market. And I know like your marketing mix is your marketing mix, right? It's the same principles of marketing, and you have product, price, place, and promotion. And people think, oh, it's easy. I'm just gonna, employ my marketing mix in another market. there are significant adaptations that need to be made to each element, or may need to be made to each element of your marketing mix. We've already talked about new product, adaptation, your pricing strategy. So this is something that needs great focus, because your pricing strategy may need to be changed. Margins are very different when you start exporting. There are unique challenges. There are additional costs. There's overhead, the landed costs are different. So looking at your pricing strategy, and just because you follow one strategy in one market doesn't mean you necessarily follow that same strategy in other markets. We already talked about the different promotional messages and promotional channels. So taking into account tastes and behaviors and preferences in the market. So there's so much there. I don't know, we don't have tons of time, but Daniel, can you just tell us maybe about some of those little cultural nuances? I know you alluded to it before with the different markets. You talked about in Britain with their, love of classic teas, but were there any other cultural nuances that you had to take into account when you were on your export journey?
Yes. So one of the big things now, this might not apply to every business, and I understand, but if at all possible in any way, customization, if doable, is a very, very competitive way or strategy of marketing to go into a new market. If you're able to tweak, customize, or tailor your product in any way to suit that market that you're going into, I think that has such a strong punch when entering a new market. I mean, it might be easier for us. We could name it, New York, the New Yorker blend or something like that. So, it's very easy to do that. Maybe not every product can do that, but if you can tailor your product or customize your product in any way, I think that is number one, a really, really good way of standing out from your competition and really piercing through even your competitors that are in that market as well. So that was huge for us. We were able to customize. Then we had to, you have to tie in pricing. If you've done a good job in your pricing and your margins, taking into account things like shipping, returns, and things like that, if you really got good pricing on your product, find inexpensive ways of giving additional value. So in us, when we started with our e-commerce shipping teas, we started something where you buy one tea and you get 3 flavors of other blends, right? And so they were very inexpensive to add to the shipment. We also made every shipment go out with a personal handwritten letter. Now, mind you, that can get very labor intensive, so maybe find a way to automate certain processes. But by adding 3 free samples, which we put on our website, 3 free samples with each purchase, by adding the handwritten letter, we gave more value than what the customer had paid for, and it kept a longer life cycle for that customer. And so customization, value adds, and perks, these are ways, maybe if they buy this, they get a digital download of something. All of these ways, they make you like Hercules in the market, even though you're just entering. And so these are some of the ways that worked with us. And then I know I talked about influencer marketing, kickbacks. Don't be afraid to incentivize people in that market to spread the word for you. They will do it, and they'll do it authentically, and they're understood where they're from. So don't be afraid to incentivize. And then, of course, trade shows. Trade show as a form of marketing, you cannot beat being in front of your customer or potential customer. We have a rule in our company: when we go out to trade shows, we kick away the chairs and we are on our feet all day, not just saying try our product, but drumming up conversations and spending time building relationships. We always book an additional day to stay there and act on those leads, right? And so it's fresh, it's there, you're there, you get to go to lunch, meet potential clients. So I think as Canadians, if we get more aggressive in our approach to driving business in international markets, we'll start to see the results. Customization, value adds and perks, and then those in-person building relationships were the ways that we did it.
Just a
Fantastic.
point to add, Laura, if I may,
Yep.
on pricing is very much related to payment terms. And if you're entering a market, you obviously have to adapt to the pricing in the market, but you also want to be very careful about payment terms. And if in the industry, it's a normal payment terms of 30 days, and you start to agree to 90 days or 180 days for your product, you may be gaining some market access, but you could be putting yourself in a difficult risk management situation. So, as a company plans their approach, I always ask them to consider the pricing and payment terms in together, because your buyer will be interested in both, and he'll want the best deal on both ends of it. And if you're sometimes too accommodative, you could be giving yourself headaches later. So
Absolutely.
we can talk more about that on with EDC financing, but that's a very key point, I think.
I was just going to add, and maybe as a question, Marvin, with EDC, if I'm not mistaken, do they have ways, I believe, where they could help cover some of those terms and give you the financing and kind of act as a intermediary, so that you are more, I guess, you can go out there and really drum up those orders, knowing that even though it's going to be 90 days until you get paid, EDC in some cases could step in and give you the cash and then deal with that consumer. Do I have that correctly?
You got it right, and that's my sort of home base. So when a company looks at offering terms, you've got big risks of default by the buyer, which could happen at any time. You've got the risk of repudiation, so you've shipped your goods and the buyer is not accepting them. You've got the risk of insolvency, even if you've done your homework, and that can happen. You've got risks that you can't get the funds out of the country, so it's an inconvertibility or transfer problem. And you've got other permit problems, the goods can't come in. So one of the main programs at EDC is the accounts receivable insurance for smaller companies and larger, but particularly applicable to smaller companies, where up to 90% of that receivable can be insured against non-payment due to any of those reasons I mentioned. And together with that insurance, the exporter can go to his bank and access further working capital because he's got those receivables insured. The bank will consider it like a domestic receivable. So that is an extremely important program, and I know that when I was there, we offered that to the smallest exporters, and EDC still does that, and it can make the difference between survival and in a particular year and not. So that is a very important risk management tool, and EDC and the banks are working closer together than ever before. So once a company is starting to get ongoing exports, they can get a loan from the bank for their exports, and EDC will guarantee up to 50% of that. So it's starting off with the accounts receivable insurance, building it to an export guarantee support, and then there's even potential to provide financing to your buyer in the foreign market that EDC can do. So when I was in Mexico, I was actually building relationships with some of the buyers of Canadian companies and setting up lines of credit so they could easily access it for any Canadian supplier. So that's another way in which EDC can come into it, and a $200 million line of credit with Pemex could be accessed by a small Canadian company selling systems equipment, and everyone gains from that. So that is a very key point. Think of it as risk management and market expansion all in one. So that, I think, should be considered as any company moves along.
Excellent, excellent. So great points about international trade finance. Fantastic. And just this is an area where you need to rely on the partners out there and get advice and use the tools and resources that are available to you. So another area where we might need some assistance and support is when we talk about supply chain and logistics. And I just see our time is slowly ticking away, or quickly ticking away. So I'm just going to jump right into this and ask you, Marvin, are there supply chain issues right now? Because we know that supply chain issues continue to be a concern world, like on a global basis. How do you approach setting up international supply chains for first-time exporters who might be overwhelmed and have low tolerance for risk? So taking into account the questions we've had about risk, am I too small? This is an area that supply chain and logistics can be very daunting. So what are some of the, how would you approach this if you're advising your clients and other small, like SMEs?
Well, obviously, the supply chain issue is a minefield these days, and any company, small or large, wants to, first of all, if they're relying on supplies from outside of the country, really do the analysis of that supplier's capability, their capacity to be consistent, the issues that might be there with their country, and any geopolitical issues that might be involved. So that's the first step is, how reliable is my supplier in general? And, can that product be sourced in Canada is also part of that analysis, and the price at the price that is being offered. So then when you get past that, you're looking at trying to take some steps to stagger the commitments. So you may be receiving your supply in 30 days and you don't have to deliver to your buyer for another 90 days or something like that. So staggering the process so you're not caught. There are various other ways in which you can put the onus on the supplier, including by asking for performance guarantees. So they are putting money up to guarantee their performance. You can also look at the payment terms. So they need to deliver to you on a CIF basis, and you're not dealing with some of the issues of getting the product in. And this is where I think, Laura, the freight forwarders and customs agents can be hugely important. And what I recommend to my companies is that they do an analysis on the top 3 freight forwarders and really ask the questions about their capacity to guide them on markets and issues in those markets, because even smaller companies rely on critical components, and if those are interrupted or you can't source in Canada at a price, then you're in the dire straits. So relying on those customs agents and freight forward is very important in this area. Great advice.
So I just wanted to touch on the last area that we haven't really, but we've touched on it a bit, is like legal and ethical issues. And I don't think we can, go through the export journey without touching on some of these. We have talked about regulations in the market, determining if there are regulatory considerations, but other understanding, other legal issues like laws concerning international contracts and negotiations, how to mitigate and settle contract disputes. So these are areas that you need to pay particular attention to. Other things like, is there a free trade agreement in effect? And what are the specific requirements of the buyer and seller under that particular trade agreement, like in terms of cross-border movement of personnel, rules of origin. I mean, we don't even have time to even delve into any of these areas, how to protect your IP, your intellectual property in international markets. So it's a bit of a minefield. There are many, there could be many legal challenges, but there can also, we'll end it here, there can also be some ethical challenges as well that often, small businesses don't even have on their radar. So Marvin, I'm going to ask you, probably the last chance here. We've touched on those legal regulatory issues, some of them. What would you say are some of the ethical issues that businesses might come up against in international markets?
Okay, well, as you say, there's a minefield there, but what I would put at the top level is the whole issue of transparency and corruption. And many of your viewers may know that Canadian companies are subject to the Corruption of Foreign Public Officials Act here in Canada. So if a Canadian company is found to be bribing a international public sector official in a foreign country, they can be prosecuted here in Canada. I've served in big markets like India and Mexico, where the corruption perception index is quite a lot higher than it is here in Canada. So that is a risk. And one of my colleagues who did a lot of work in India said that the best strategy he could advise after 20 years of working in a market like India is to state your ethical policy upfront as you have your first meetings with a buyer, and not hold back that your company does not condone this kind of activity and you're not able to offer any extras. So there's all kinds of shades of gray in this, Laura, as you would know, but Canadian companies are under increasing pressure because Canada has this law, and it's in line with other countries in the OECD, and the number of prosecutions to Canadian companies has been quite a lot lower. So there's increased pressure that we need to respect this law. And I've seen many red flags of corruption in my day in serving in these markets, where you see things like, your agent is having meetings with government officials on the side. You're seeing intermediaries in the process, and you're wondering why this third party is getting a piece of the action. You've got to be very careful, and you need to do compliance with your employees and make sure that they are respecting your policies, particularly when, in a lot of cases, they're far off in another country and you only may be visiting them once or twice a year. You need to be checking on that, because the consequences, and this is what this fellow told me, is that even if you're not prosecuted, but there's noise out there that you might have been involved in a corrupt deal, that will do damage to your company. And so I would put that one at the top. There are other big issues that some Canadian companies have faced on the environmental file, on human rights. And, having been at EDC, I always say that to my current colleagues that I had it easy because I didn't have to have all these checkoff lists, reputational risk, environmental risk. They're now under much more scrutiny. And if EDC is doing that, Canadian companies need to do that scrutiny as well. So this is obviously for many big markets, underdeveloped or developing markets. But as we all know, corruption can happen anywhere as well.
Yeah, for sure. And I just wanted to add on that before I pass it over to you, Isabel. I just wanted to add that certified international trade professionals, they take an oath that they will engage in ethical business conduct when they, they're as part of their designation and holders of their designation, they take this ethical oath. So understand that international trade professional CITPs do understand, the way of doing business and the way not of doing business, and understand some of those ethical challenges in different markets. So on that note, I will pass it back over to you, Isabel, because we're out of time.
Amazing. Yeah, thank you so much. That was incredible. There was so many nuggets of gold shared. So thank you to all three of you for participating today. Laura, thank you so much for guiding the conversation, and to Daniel and Marvin for donating your time and expertise. I was busy taking notes the entire time, so I know I learned a lot. So I'm sure the entrepreneurs in the room have equally learned quite a lot as well. So thank you so much for your time today. Once again, before I just go into my closing remarks, I do have a quick feedback poll for our attendees that are still here, so I will launch that. We always love to hear back on how you've enjoyed your experience, and we always want to make sure that we're providing the correct programming for you. So if you could let us know your feedback, it'll take you only a few seconds to complete that. So while that's up on your screens, so again, thank you to all three of our speakers today, really appreciate it. Thank you to our co-presenting partners, EDC, TCS, and UPS, our national community partners, Forum for International Trade Training, and especially to you, FITT, because you put on this fantastic event today, as well as MasterCard, Scotiabank, eBay, and Google. And if this discussion has inspired you to take the next steps into going global, we are running wildcard applications for our pitch competition all throughout this month. So if you are an early stage entrepreneur and you'd like to be in with a chance of winning up to $75,000 in cash prize, you can apply before July 31st. And I'll put a little link in the chat so that you can learn more about that. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and we hope you have a good rest of your Thursday.
Thank you, Isabel.
Thanks,
Thank you so
Isabel.
much.
Thank you. Take care, guys.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.